Imagine risking your life for your country, only to have a cop pull a gun on you at a funeral. This is the story that left America speechless. The air was thick with grief. Rows of chairs lined the manicured grass, each one occupied by men and women in pressed uniforms, their shoulders squared, their expressions hardened by loss. The casket, draped in an American flag, sat at the front beneath a grey sky, a somber backdrop for a life honored in service. Sergeant Major David Coleman adjusted the sleeves of his dress uniform, his chest heavy with memories. The man they were burying today wasn't just a fellow soldier. He was a brother in arms, a friend, a man who had saved his life more than once on foreign soil. The loss cut deep, but Coleman stood tall, his posture unyielding despite the weight of sorrow pressing down on his heart. Families huddled together, some wiping away silent tears, others holding on to each other for strength. Military officials stood in stiff formation, the weight of duty evident in their eyes. The 21-gun salute was only minutes away, the moment everyone dreaded but knew was coming. Among the attendees, a few local police officers stood in uniform, paying their respects. It was common for law enforcement to be present at military funerals. Many of them were veterans themselves. But one officer, standing slightly apart from the others, wasn't focused on the ceremony. Officer Bradley Whitaker. His gaze was locked onto Coleman, studying him with an intensity that didn't fit the setting. The subtle shift in his stance, the way his hand hovered near his belt, suggested something far from respect. Suspicion, mistrust, maybe even hostility. Coleman didn't notice at first. His focus remained on the ceremony, the weight of loss too heavy to be distracted. But when he shifted slightly, adjusting the medals on his chest, he caught it, the unmistakable stare. At first he ignored it. It wasn't the first time a cop had looked at him like that. Being a black man in uniform, he had long since accepted the uneasy reality that some people struggled to reconcile his presence in spaces they weren't used to seeing him. But then Whitaker moved closer. His hand rested on the radio clipped to his shoulder, his mouth tightening as if he were debating whether to call something in. The funeral continued around them, muffled sobs, the rustling of the flag in the wind, the quiet murmur of a chaplain's voice delivering the eulogy. But Coleman could feel it now. That tension, growing thick like an approaching storm. Then, just as the first rifle cracked in the air for the 21-gun salute, Whitaker stepped forward, and he spoke. "Hey, you. Let me see some ID." The moment should have been about honor, about remembrance. But in an instant the air shifted, and Coleman knew this wasn't about the funeral anymore. But what happened next? No one was prepared for that. Coleman turned his head slowly, barely believing what he had just heard. "Excuse me?" His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, one that only came from years of discipline, of learning when to hold back and when to push forward. Officer Whitaker didn't blink. "ID, now." His hand hovered near his duty belt, fingers close to his holster. The funeral was still happening. The chaplain was mid-sentence, rifles cracked in the distance, and grieving families were locked in their pain. But now, something else was happening too. A shift, a disturbance. A few people turned their heads, whispers rippling through the crowd. Coleman let out a slow breath, keeping his posture controlled. He had dealt with men like Whitaker before, the type that saw a uniform but not the man wearing it. He reached into his pocket, deliberately slow, making sure there was no room for misinterpretation. He wasn't about to give this cop a reason to fear for his life. "I don't know what you think is happening here," Coleman said, pulling out his military ID, "but I'm attending a funeral, just like you." Whitaker barely glanced at the ID before scoffing. "Yeah? And why are you standing so close to the family?" Coleman's patience thinned. "Because I served with the man in that casket. We fought together. We bled together." He took a step forward, keeping his tone even. "You want to tell me what exactly you think I'm doing here?" Whitaker stiffened. Something flashed in his eyes. Not fear, but a twisted kind of certainty, like he had already decided that Coleman was a problem before he ever spoke a word. "Got a report about a suspicious individual," Whitaker said flatly. "You match the description." Coleman let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course, the old excuse. He could already guess how this would go. Whitaker would claim he was just doing his job, that he was following protocol. Meanwhile, a man who had served his country, who had earned his place here, was being questioned like a criminal. The murmurs in the crowd were growing louder. The honor guard standing near the casket exchanged uneasy glances. One of the other officers present, a young black woman in uniform, took a small step forward, as if debating whether to intervene. Coleman locked eyes with Whitaker. "You need to step back. This isn't the time or place." But Whitaker wasn't listening. Instead, he stepped closer. "I don't take orders from you." Coleman's jaw tightened. He could feel his pulse steady, his body responding like it had countless times before in combat, assessing, calculating, deciding the safest move. Except this wasn't a battlefield, and his enemy wasn't holding a rifle. It was a cop with an ego and a gun. More people were watching now. The widow, standing near the casket, face streaked with tears, looked toward them in confusion. She knew Coleman. She knew he had fought alongside her husband. The moment she recognized what was happening, her expression twisted into something like horror. "Officer!" she called out suddenly, stepping forward. "He's a soldier! He's family!" But Whitaker didn't acknowledge her. Instead, his hand dropped to his holster. The movement was subtle, but Coleman saw it, and he knew. The rules had just changed, and in the next moment, everything would go to hell. Everything happened in slow motion. The moment Whitaker's fingers touched his holster, Coleman's entire body tensed. Every instinct honed over decades of service screamed at him. This was real. This was happening. The widow gasped. A few people stood up from their seats, sensing danger. The young black officer, her name tag read Officer Gaines, took another step forward, her hand hovering near her own holster, but she hesitated. This was a funeral. A place of honor, of grief. No one should have to draw a weapon here. But Whitaker didn't care about that. With one swift motion, he pulled his gun. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone screamed. The chaplain's words cut off mid-sentence. The honor guard, trained soldiers, shifted their stances, but held back, torn between protocol and sheer disbelief at what they were witnessing. The barrel of Whitaker's pistol locked onto Coleman's chest. "Hands where I can see them," Whitaker barked. His voice was sharp, aggressive. A voice that had been waiting for this moment, itching for an excuse. Coleman's hands rose slowly, palms open. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew, one wrong move, and this man would kill him. The crowd was frozen in horror. A soldier, a decorated veteran, a man who had fought for his country, now standing at gunpoint at a funeral. For a few seconds, no one moved. The weight of what was happening hung heavy in the air. Then, Coleman spoke. "Put the gun down, officer." His voice was low, controlled, but there was an undeniable steel beneath it. The tone of a man who had been through worse, but refused to be broken by this. Whitaker's hands didn't steady. If anything, his grip tightened. His breathing was sharp, erratic. He wanted control of the situation, but it was slipping away, and he could feel it. And that made him dangerous. The widow, still clutching the folded flag from her husband's casket, stepped forward. "Please," she choked out. "This is wrong. He's not a threat." Others started speaking up too. "What are you doing?" "He's a soldier, man." "Put the damn gun away." Officer Gaines finally made her move. "Bradley," she said, her voice firm but measured. "Holster your weapon. Now." Whitaker's eyes flicked toward her, and that second of distraction was all it took. A sharp, commanding voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down!" A man stepped forward from the back of the crowd, tall, older, his uniform decorated with stars, the kind of man even Whitaker had to respect. It was General Martin Steele. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. Whitaker froze. His expression flickered. Hesitation, realization, then something closer to panic. He had made a mistake, a massive one. And now, there was no way out. The general stepped closer, his voice deadly calm. "You just pulled a weapon on a decorated war hero, at a funeral, in front of witnesses." He let the words sink in. "Put the gun down." For the first time, uncertainty cracked through Whitaker's face, and then he lowered the gun. A sharp exhale swept through the crowd. A few people visibly relaxed, but the damage had already been done. Someone had filmed everything, and within hours the world would see it. The silence after Whitaker lowered his gun was almost as loud as the moment he drew it. For a few long seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire funeral had been frozen in time, held captive by what had just happened. The honor guard, trained to maintain their composure, looked shaken. The widow clutched the folded flag in her arms, her face a mixture of grief and fury. And then, somewhere in the crowd, a voice broke the silence. "He had no reason to do that." Another voice followed. "He pulled a gun on a soldier. At a funeral." A wave of disbelief, of anger, swept through the crowd. But Whitaker was already backing away. His face was pale, his hand shaking as he reholstered his gun. He looked around, as if realizing for the first time that there were dozens of witnesses, that cameras were rolling, that his career, his reputation, maybe even his freedom, were hanging by a thread. Officer Gaines stepped forward. "You're done," she said quietly, her voice unreadable. She reached for the radio on her shoulder. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor at—" But Whitaker spun toward her, his face twisting. "Are you serious? You're gonna do this to me?" His voice was lower now, desperate. "I was doing my job." The widow stepped forward. "Your job?" Her voice was raw, shaking. "You just pulled a gun on the man who fought beside my husband, the man who tried to save him." She took another step. "You ruined his funeral. And for what?" Whitaker had no answer. By now, other officers had arrived, alerted by the commotion. One of them, a sergeant, listened to a few murmured words from Gaines before stepping forward. He didn't ask any questions. He just turned to Whitaker and said, "Hand over your badge and weapon." Whitaker hesitated. "Now." His jaw clenched. He unbuckled his belt, removed his holster and handed it over. And just like that, it was over. For now. The video hit the internet within the hour. Someone in the crowd had been streaming live, and within minutes, the footage was on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, everywhere. It spread like wildfire. A police officer pulling a gun on a decorated veteran at a funeral. It wasn't just a news story. It was a reckoning. The comments poured in. "This is what we've been saying for years. That man fought for this country, and this is how he's treated. Fire him, charge him, lock him up. This is why we don't trust them." Major networks picked up the story. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News. It was no longer just an incident. It was a national scandal. Then came the official response. The police department issued a statement saying Whitaker had been placed on leave pending an investigation. But that wasn't enough. Not for the public. Not when there was clear, undeniable video evidence. By the end of the week, the mayor had given a press conference. "We will ensure full accountability," he said. "No one is above the law." But the real moment, the one that sent shockwaves across the country, came when the district attorney announced charges: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, abuse of authority, hate crime enhancements. The message was clear. This wasn't just another slap on the wrist. Whitaker was going to trial, and if convicted, he wasn't walking away. The trial was unavoidable. With video evidence flooding every news cycle, public pressure mounted like never before. The district attorney had no choice but to move forward with the case. There were too many eyes watching, too many voices demanding accountability. Bradley Whitaker sat stiffly in the courtroom, his once confident posture now replaced with something far less assured. The charges were serious: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, abuse of authority, and hate crime enhancements. If convicted, he wasn't just losing his badge. He was facing decades behind bars. On the opposite side of the room, Sergeant Major David Coleman sat in silence. He hadn't spoken to the media much after the incident. He let the video speak for itself. But now, as he sat in the witness stand, his voice carried the weight of every veteran, every black man, every person who had ever been unjustly targeted. The prosecutor didn't hold back. "Sergeant Major Coleman, tell us exactly what happened that day." Coleman took a breath. "I was attending a funeral, a soldier's funeral, a man I fought beside." His voice was steady. "And in the middle of it, an officer approached me, not to pay his respects, but to question why I was there, as if I didn't belong." The courtroom was silent. The prosecutor nodded. "And when you showed him your military ID, did that stop the confrontation?" Coleman's jaw clenched slightly. "No." "What happened next?" Coleman's eyes locked onto Whitaker across the courtroom. "He pulled his gun on me." A murmur ran through the gallery. Even though they had all seen the video, hearing it said out loud hit differently. Whitaker's attorney tried everything. "My client was responding to a report of a suspicious individual. He was following department protocol. The situation was tense, and he made a split-second decision. But none of it held up. The video footage was undeniable. The testimonies were airtight. And when Officer Gaines took the stand, her words sealed Whitaker's fate. That man was no threat. He was a soldier attending a funeral, and my colleague escalated it for no reason. I told him to stand down. He refused. He pulled his weapon in front of grieving families. It was reckless. It was dangerous. And it was wrong." Whitaker sat motionless as the jury was sent to deliberate. They returned in less than 3 hours. Guilty, on all counts. The judge didn't mince words. "Officer Whitaker, your actions were an egregious abuse of power. You used your badge not to protect, but to intimidate. Your reckless behavior could have ended a man's life, at a funeral no less. The fact that this was racially motivated makes it even more reprehensible." Whitaker stared ahead, emotionless, as the judge delivered the sentence. "Life in prison, without the possibility of parole." Gasps filled the courtroom. Some people couldn't believe it. A cop getting life. That never happened. But today, it did. For Coleman, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about Whitaker. It was about something bigger. For the first time, accountability had caught up with a man who thought his badge made him untouchable. When the verdict was read, the courtroom felt different. Not like a celebration, not even relief. Just something heavy lifting, something long overdue finally happening. Sergeant Major David Coleman didn't smile. He didn't cheer. This wasn't a victory. It was justice. A rare moment where the system did what it was supposed to do. As he walked out of the courthouse, the press swarmed. Reporters shoved microphones in his face, cameras flashing, voices overlapping. "Sergeant Major Coleman, do you feel justice was served? What do you have to say to Officer Whitaker? What message does this send to the country?" He stopped, looked right at the cameras. "I want people to remember what happened. Not just to me, but to every person who's ever been judged before they were even given a chance to exist in someone else's mind. This wasn't just about me, it was about all of us. The video of that moment spread almost as fast as the original footage. People called it historic. Some called it a wake-up call. But others, they called it a warning. Because if a cop could lose everything for abusing his power, what did that mean for the ones who thought they were untouchable? There were debates. Some said the sentence was too harsh. Others said it wasn't enough. But at the end of the day, one fact remained. A man who had sworn to protect and serve had done the opposite, and he paid for it. This wasn't just one case, it was a shift, a sign that things could change if people demanded it loud enough. So the question is, what happens next? Because justice isn't just about one courtroom, one case, or one cop who got what he deserved. It's about making sure this never happens again. So if you believe in that, speak up. Hold them accountable. Demand better. Because silence is what lets it happen again. And after today, there are no more excuses.